In the first months of World War I, Germany came within striking distance of Paris, but what followed wasn't a swift victory. It was 4 years of the most brutal industrial warfare humanity had ever witnessed. This is the story of how modern warfare, economics, and technology collided to reshape the world forever. Germany failed to achieve the decisive victory it had come so close to in the First Battle of the Marne during the war's opening months, and despite the German armies approaching close enough to capture Paris, they were forced to retreat. After the First Battle of the Marne, the Germans turned north, aiming to capture English channel ports like Dunkirk and Pas-de-Calais to cut off the British Expeditionary Force's logistics and outflank the Franco-British defensive lines from the north. This operation would also be thwarted by the British Army's counter-maneuver. With the rapidly growing British Expeditionary Force armies, Germany no longer had the opportunity to win victory through a classic Prussian-style pitched battle. The Germans' only option on the Western Front was to withdraw to defensible lines and switch to strategic defense. The British and French armies facing them were superior in numbers and firepower. However, the artillery weapons, machine guns, barbed wire, and modern fortification systems of the era provided the defending side with a tremendous advantage. Now the sides had dug trenches and established mutual positions from the English Channel to Switzerland. This terrible and static war would last for 4 full years. The new German Chief of General Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, had correctly read Germany's predicament at the end of 1914. Since war gave the defending side enormous superiority, it was impossible to break through the Franco-British front, which had now become superior on the Western Front. In the East, despite delivering blow after blow to the Russians, the immense width and depth of this front promised Germany no short-term victory. Thus, Germany would shift from the annihilation strategy designed to decisively defeat its enemies to an attrition strategy. By the end of 1914, Germany had captured 64% of France's iron ore, 62% of its steel production, and 50% of its coal reserves, occupying a very large part of northern France and Belgium. In this state, it had enormous leverage for a possible peace table. If the Germans could sufficiently weaken the Franco-British armies, there was an opportunity to end the war not with a decisive victory for themselves, but with an advantageous peace agreement. The war had now become a war of attrition in which the sides mobilized all their economic resources for military victory. Germany's industrial and military capacity was at a disadvantage against France, Britain, and Russia. Moreover, Germany had to prevent the collapse of its ally, the Austrian Empire, in its war against Russia. To compare the relative economic strengths of the warring powers with numbers, France, Britain, and Russia's share of world industrial production in 1913 was 28%, while Germany and Austria's share was at the 19% level. While the Allies, Britain, France, and Russia, used 312 million tons of coal-equivalent energy in 1913, the Central Powers, Germany and Austria, consumed 236 million tons of coal-equivalent energy. While the Allies' steel production that same year was 17 million tons, the Central Powers produced 20 million tons of steel. When the Allies fully utilized their industrial capacities, they could mobilize approximately 50% more than the Central Powers' industrial capacities. In addition to these advantages of the Allies, Germany and Austria were under complete naval blockade. While German industry turned to more expensive synthetic intermediate product production, France and Britain were importing enormous amounts of raw materials from their own colonies and Latin America. Moreover, this import was financed by credits opened by American banks. Please note this paragraph carefully. I will explain later how the Western Allies financing this long and large-scale war in this way would make the United States, which had not yet entered the war, an economic superpower. Meanwhile, the submarine age had begun when a German submarine sank 3 British cruisers without destroyer escort in just 2 hours on September 22, 1914.
Small naval vessels like submarines, fast torpedo boats, and mine layers would limit the operations of main battleships up to 40,000 tons built with extraordinary resources such as dreadnought and super dreadnought types. For example, remember the role of the mine layer Nusret in a Gallipoli naval battle. The mines laid by a small ship sank 3 main battleships, all pre-dreadnought designs, and prevented the Allied fleet from entering the straits. The Falkland Islands naval battle at the end of 1914 shows how pre-dreadnought design warships had become obsolete. 2 modern warships, battlecruiser type, in the British task force, accompanied by 5 British cruisers, effortlessly sank 5 German cruisers without even entering the enemy's range. The British numerical superiority in modern warships would ensure the continuation of the relentless naval blockade against Germany. The German Navy, the world's second-largest naval power, was not in a position to go out into the North Sea and break the blockade. This is where the Germans' dilemma began. The British Navy had no concern about changing its position. To change this status quo, the Germans had to risk their fleets, and no one intended to send a whole fleet on a suicide mission. Therefore, with the exception of the Doggerbank or Jutland naval battles, the German Navy, which had consumed enormous resources, did not challenge the British Navy. The German strategy of luring the British Navy to the North German coasts, where traps had been set with mines and submarines, also did not work. The Germans would then begin unlimited submarine warfare against the Allies in February 1915. Ships belonging to neutral countries would be counted as targets when they entered French and British waters. This would increase tension between Germany and the United States. The Germans' attempt to blockade the Allies with submarines was asymmetric. Neutral country ships were simply turned back by the British Navy before they could reach German ports. However, German submarines had no such chance. A submarine could not surface and turn back a ship it detected, nor could it seize these ships. The submarine had only one option: to detect its target, fire its torpedoes, and sink the target. German submarine warfare would eventually bring into the war against Germany the parties that sold raw materials to the Western Allies, transported these materials, or financed these goods. The year 1915 would pass with British, French armies' offensives against the Germans in the west and German offensives on Russian Poland in the east.
On April 22, 1915, the Germans used chemical weapons for the first time at Ypres. The famous chemist Fritz Haber, who had created the Haber-Bosch process at the beginning of the 20th century and introduced the world to synthetic fertilizer, had given Germany a strategic weapon in World War I: chemical weapons. When the Germans used this weapon at Ypres on a limited scale without being fully prepared, the weapon lost its surprise effect. The Allies quickly produced gas masks and developed their own chemical weapons. Now, chemical weapons would be widely used in the war until its end. In 1915, the Germans had put chlorine gas in cylinders and used it by calculating the wind's effect. Later, the sides would both diversify these weapons and fire these gases at their enemies with artillery shells. When the gas alarm was given, it was necessary to race against seconds to put on the gas mask. Those seconds determined for soldiers whether they would be blinded or whether their lungs would be roasted like cooked meat. The war had taken an even more horrific turn. In 1915, British and French offensives did not push back the Germans. The offensives at Champagne, Saint-Mihiel, Loos, and Neuve-Chapelle only changed the front by 10 to 20 kilometers, but cost hundreds of thousands of French and British soldiers, 1.5 million French and 300,000 British dead, wounded, and captured. However, on the Eastern Front in 1915, the Germans and Austrians had pushed back hundreds of kilometers in Russian Poland and Galicia, inflicting terrible losses on the Russians. The Russians had lost 250,000 soldiers at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes.
400,000 in central Poland, and 1 million in Galicia, eastern Russian Poland, and the Carpathians. The Russian armies were too large to be completely annihilated, but when farmers who produced grain in villages and towns began to be conscripted to replace these terrible losses, grain supply would fall and basic food inflation would skyrocket. The reason the price index in Russia climbed from a level of 100 in June 1914 to 792 in June 1917 was not just supply shock. The Russians, unlike the Western Allies, instead of borrowing in American dollars and financing imports with these dollars to run the war industry, were borrowing directly from the domestic market and trying to service this debt by printing money. Now, the 1917 revolutions could be seen from afar. Another misfortune of the Russians was that Germany's best military leaders were on the Eastern Front. Perhaps the best general of the entire war, 66-year-old Field Marshal August von Mackensen, had devastated the Russians in Poland and Galicia, completely occupied Serbia, which the Austrians had been unable to overcome in 1914, and later brought Romania, which entered the war in 1916, to its knees. The Germans had thus also occupied the Romanian oil fields. Mackensen's victories would break Russia's back and be the most important cause of the February 1917 and then October 1917 Bolshevik revolutions. In May 1915, the Italians would enter the war on the side of the Allies. With this development, the weak Austrian Empire now had to fight on 3 fronts. The Italians' goal was to take the Trentino and South Tyrol regions. However, the Austrians had prepared a tremendous defense in these regions, surrounded by high mountains and rivers. The Italians would waste hundreds of thousands of their soldiers in 11 attempts to dislodge the Austrians at Isonzo. South Tyrol, one of the world's most enchanting places, had become the graveyard of Italian soldiers. The British and French 1915 Gallipoli campaign against the Ottoman Empire was another strategic mistake. After losing the naval battle, the Allies insisted on their mistakes and tried to reach Istanbul by landing on the peninsula, but the battle at Gallipoli had also turned into a trench war. The Gallipoli battles were the awakening of the Turkish nation after a shameful defeat in the Balkan Wars. Lieutenant Colonel Mustafa Kemal Bey, Ataturk, the shining star of the war, had appeared before history by demonstrating his leadership and command abilities. However, if the Allies had made a landing at Alexandretta instead of Gallipoli, they would have captured a strategic region that was far from Istanbul in terms of logistics and therefore quite difficult to defend, namely the junctions of railways reaching the Middle East, and would have had an opportunity to divide the empire in two. In 1915, the German General Staff changed their strategy. Falkenhayn selected a point on the Western Front that the French couldn't sacrifice, massing all German heavy artillery at this location, a total of 1,200 guns, 2/3 of which were heavy or very heavy guns, forcing the French to defend this point, aiming to melt them with firepower and remove the French armies from being a fighting force. The point Falkenhayn chose was Verdun, France's national pride. Indeed, Verdun had been a gateway where Germanic and Frankish peoples had separated for thousands of years and was like a Paris identity for the French. Verdun is one of the bloodiest 2 battles in the history of civilization. Although the German strategy initially worked, the advantage of defense showed itself here too, and although the French gradually retreated, they inflicted considerable casualties on the attacking German divisions. The Verdun battle began to fade as a result of the British offensive started at the Somme. French and German casualties in the 10-month battle at Verdun, February to December 1916, are thought to have exceeded 1 million soldiers in total. Although the British Somme offensive did not change the front very much,
For the first time, the Germans felt the weight of the enormous resources on which the British-French power rested. Moreover, on top of the Verdun and Somme battles, the Brusilov strategic offensive launched by the Russians in the east against the Central Powers, and Romania also entered the war on the side of the Allies. The Somme and Verdun battles are terrible wars in which thousands of guns fired millions of shells, and the lifespan of a classical soldier in the trenches was reduced to 2 to 3 weeks. The warring sides had fully grasped that the number of artillery weapons and explosive artillery shells was a variable that would win or lose the war. In fact, British Prime Minister H. Asquith had resigned in 1915-1916 due to insufficient artillery shell production, and D. Lloyd George had come to lead the war coalition. The British Expeditionary Force commander had also changed, and Marshal Sir Douglas Haig had taken command. The German failure at Verdun also displaced Falkenhayn. Germany's military leadership had passed into the hands of Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, the two highest-ranking generals on the Eastern Front. Ludendorff and Hindenburg had now effectively transferred the political power of Emperor Wilhelm II and his cabinet to themselves, also taking control of Germany's political and economic control. The Allies had used tanks for the first time at the Somme. Tanks were designed to eliminate the defenders' advantage. However, the first tanks were slow, breakdown-prone machines. The Germans, apart from a few experimental models and captured enemy tanks, would not have tanks throughout the entire war.
In 1915, for the first time, aircraft capable of firing machine guns through the rotating propeller appeared on the scene, and aerial combat had also begun. Aerial combat mostly provided air superiority over the frontline airspace, enabling observation by aircraft. In World War I, aircraft could not yet be widely used against ground targets, enemy logistics centers, or enemy cities. By 1917, Italy, Austria, and Russia were militarily and economically exhausted. The Russian Brusilov offensive in 1916, coordinated with the Somme and Verdun, had removed the Austrians from being a fighting force in the east, but it had also completely exhausted the Russians. Moreover, the Russians were now unable to withstand the fresh German armies in the east. The Germans' losses at the Somme were very heavy, but lighter compared to the British. The Germans could rapidly transport their armies to the east with perfectly designed railways, using the advantage of defense on the Western Front, and then send these units back. However, the Germans needed to withdraw their armies to a more suitable defensive line in the west in 1917, for the Allies were preparing for a series of even larger offensives similar to the Somme. The Germans would find the solution to this problem by pulling back the front, shortening it, and establishing a new defensive line, the Hindenburg Line. This line consisted of successive defensive positions built on the reverse slope of mountains and hills. This defensive line built on the reverse slope was also largely protected from enemy artillery fire. Behind, railways had been built to reinforce this defensive line. Thousands of kilometers of barbed wire had been positioned in zigzags. Concrete shelters were made of concrete and steel of quality to withstand the heaviest artillery fire. Moreover, these concrete shelters were largely buried underground. The Germans had established complete air superiority over the area while this line was being built, and their armies were secretly withdrawing to this defensive line. After the Germans withdrew to this line, the French launched a major offensive named after their commander-in-chief, Nivelle, also called the Second Battle of the Aisne. This offensive was a complete fiasco. The enormous French casualties, approximately 200,000 soldiers, started a general mutiny in the French armies known for their discipline. Units were no longer obeying offensive orders. This mutiny was suppressed with difficulty. Nivelle was also removed from his post. The Hindenburg Line had withstood well against the offensive of 7,000 guns and 850,000 soldiers. Now the French were also exhausted in the war, and the burden on the Western Front was on the British. The British had dug tunnels for months under the German defensive lines at Messines and placed enormous amounts of explosives. When these were detonated, 5 full German divisions were annihilated. As a result of blowing up the underside of a huge mountain, the sound of the explosions was heard even from London and even from Dublin. Messines is the largest conventional explosive use created by human hand before the atomic age. This time, the British would launch an enormous offensive against the Germans at Passchendaele, the Third Battle of Ypres, during the July-November 1917 period. The British plan was to break the German defensive lines in Flanders, outflank the Hindenburg Line from the north, and capture the submarine bases on the occupied Belgian coast. However, this part of the year in Flanders was quite rainy. This offensive, conducted under heavy rainfall in this region where the underground water level is very close to the surface, turned into a complete fiasco. When soldiers carrying approximately 30 kilograms of weight attacked in an enormous swamp that millions of artillery shells had turned into a lunar surface, the British had lost approximately 400,000 soldiers. German casualties were at least as much. The British had only advanced 10 to 15 miles. The British loss in this battle is close to all their World War II losses. However, the British had learned how to break this strong defense system, the grab and hold strategy. This strategy, instead of trying to completely break the German front, was to destroy the first defensive positions of the front with numerous artillery, occupy this area, move the artillery forward, and continue the offensive. Ludendorff would realize with horror that the Germans had no response to this strategy, because the step-by-step advance was happening with the repositioning forward of the superior enemy artillery. Meanwhile, the Germans had shifted strong units to help the Austrians who were about to collapse in Italy. The result would be a complete disaster for the Italians. At Caporetto, the Italian armies would be routed. The Italians would lose 13,000 dead, as well as 275,000 prisoners, and another 350,000 Italian soldiers would flee and disappear. After Caporetto, the German-Austrian armies had advanced a full 150 kilometers and reached the Piave River covering Venice. The Italian government had resigned after this disgrace. 1917 was a period of extraordinary events. In February 1917, revolution broke out in Russia and the Tsar was dethroned. The Kerensky government that replaced him intended to continue the war. Meanwhile, the Germans had allowed Lenin, whom they knew was in Switzerland, to go to Russia. German agents had organized Lenin's boarding of a sealed wagon in Zurich. Thus, the train would not be inspected when passing through the German border. The train would pass from Germany to Sweden, from Sweden to Russian Finland, and reach St. Petersburg. And on October 25, 1917, the Bolsheviks would take the capital. Meanwhile, the Americans were very disturbed by the Germans' renewed unlimited submarine warfare. The German and British navies had encountered each other by chance at the Battle of Jutland in 1916. In the second-largest naval battle in history, the British Navy had fought with 28 modern main battleships, Dreadnought class, 9 battlecruisers, battlecruiser class, and 112 other warships, while the Germans fought with 16 modern main battleships, 5 battlecruisers, and 78 other warships. The Germans had saved their fleet and sunk more British ships as a result of British incompetence. However, after this battle, when the Germans withdrew their fleets to ports and focused on submarine warfare, what happened, happened. After this stage, the United States was looking for an excuse to enter the war. That excuse was given by a telegram sent to Mexico by incompetence in the German Foreign Ministry. In this telegram, German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann stated that if Mexico entered the war against the United States, it could regain the states of Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. Understanding the purpose of the telegram is not possible even today. Mexico, in chaos due to civil war and without a proper industry, could not possibly declare war on the United States, which had not yet entered the war. The telegram was decoded by British intelligence, and its contents were given to the Americans. When the telegram was published in the American press, all hell broke loose, and the United States declared war on the Central Powers on April 6, 1917. The Germans were aware of the terrible state of the American army. The Americans had not even been able to prevent Mexican revolutionaries who crossed the border stealing cattle. When the American army under General Pershing's command entered Mexico, it had been unable to even defeat Pancho Villa's revolutionaries and had been disgraced. In 1917, the Americans had neither heavy artillery nor proper aircraft nor tanks, but the Americans were in a position to send millions of fresh soldiers to Europe. Although these soldiers' training was so poor that the British and French would request that American soldiers be incorporated into their own armies and fight under their own command, the Americans would refuse this humiliating proposal for themselves. American units would fight under General Pershing's command, but would borrow all their heavy weapons from France and Britain. On November 20th, 1917, the British, using their tanks en masse for the first time, 324 tanks, crossed the Hindenburg Line at Cambrai, which the Germans had described as impenetrable. However, a German counteroffensive would push these units back. However, Cambrai had also revealed a second strategy, showing how the German defense could be overcome. When the Germans resumed unlimited submarine warfare in 1917, they had been able to sink enormous amounts of shipping. When the British war economy was about to be damaged, the convoy system changed the balance in submarine warfare. Now it had become clear that the war could not be won with submarines. American and British shipyards were producing much more than the sunk cargo ships, and German industry could not replace the shortages in submarine fleets whose losses increased due to the convoy system. The Germans began peace negotiations with Russia's new Bolshevik government at the end of 1917. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, forcibly dictated to the Russians, included Russia's withdrawal from a vast region constituting today's Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania territories, Ukraine's independence, and the separation of a large part of today's Belarus from Russia. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is one of the most ruthless treaties in history, symbolizing the entire Eastern Europe's passage under German control. Additionally, the Russians had to cede territory to the Austrian and Ottoman empires. The reasons for the Bolsheviks' acceptance of this treaty were the civil war that began with Tsarist supporters in Russia and the country's complete collapse after the revolution. While the Central Powers bore the economic burden of the war primarily on Germany, on the opposing front, with nearly half of France's heavy industry falling into German hands, the British Empire had become the backbone of the Allies. While Britain was the world's largest foreign investor before the war, in 1917, France and Britain had become the world's largest foreign debt-receiving states. While British industry produced only 91 artillery pieces, 200 aircraft, and 300 machine guns in 1914, between 1914 and 1918, the British had been able to produce 250,000 machine guns, 2,800 tanks, 25,000 pieces of artillery, and exactly 170 million artillery shells. The British had ensured that London's borrowing markets acted as guarantor to prevent the collapse of the French economy, and had even used credits they themselves obtained from American banks to extend credit to the French. In 1917, the Germans had embarked on an enormous armament and explosive production program, the Hindenburg Program. German industry aimed to create a large industrial output by drawing many people from agriculture and even from the front. This program would provide enormous productivity increases in weapons and explosive production. However, the workforce drawn from agriculture and the use of nitrates in fertilizer use for explosive production would create famine in Germany for the first time in the winter of 1916-1917. The Germans had financed the war by printing money and with war bonds because they could not borrow from international markets, and had established price controls and complex central economic management to prevent the transition of increasing money supply to inflation. In fact, all sides were planning to impose these enormous war expenditures on the opposing side
as war reparations after winning the war. The side that would lose the war would collapse not only socially and militarily, but also economically. The peace agreement made with Russia would enable the transfer of approximately 1 million German soldiers to the Western Front. Thus, the Germans had achieved a temporary superiority for the first time since 1914, until the moment American soldiers would change the balance of power. More importantly, the Germans had also developed a special offensive doctrine in which artillery and specially trained units, Stoßtruppen, worked together without having tanks. Lieutenant Colonel Georg Bruckmüller, who had tremendous intelligence, had turned into doctrine how German artillery would break the enemy's defense by opening a short but very intense and concentrated artillery barrage, followed by specially trained soldiers using infiltration techniques to infiltrate enemy lines and break the front. Time was running out for the Germans. The 50-division superiority at hand was temporary, but the formula for how to win the war was also clear. Now, the period when millions of soldiers were spent to advance a few dozen kilometers over 4 years was about to end. On March 21, 1918, the Germans would roll their dice to win the war on the Western Front. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, while waiting for hundreds of guns with individually calibrated barrels to make point shots at the enemy, specially trained storm troops, Stoßtruppen, were waiting for their officers to blow their revolving whistles for the offensive. These specially trained soldiers, completely contrary to normal, had slung their rifles crosswise on their backs, and in their hands were pistols and hand grenades with which they would clean out enemy trenches like lightning. The Germans would begin an enormous offensive on March 21, 1918 at 4:40 in the morning, and in just 5 hours, German artillery would fire exactly 3.5 million shells at the British front with an area of approximately 400 square kilometers. Now, the final act of the war had opened. As the result of the series of strategic offensives that began in the spring of 1918, the Germans envisioned winning the war decisively. The dice had now been cast. The static trench wars that had tied up millions of soldiers for 4 years were over. The Great War had once again turned into a war of maneuver. The spring of 1918 would determine the fate of empires, the future of nations, and the balance of global power for generations to come. The industrial might, human sacrifice, and strategic brilliance of World War I transformed warfare forever, and its consequences would echo through the entire 20th century.